Well, good day and welcome to worship on this March the 21st, 2021. I'm Deanne Carter and I'm the pastor of Margarettsville and Lower Granville Baptist Churches, and I extend a warm welcome to you today. Thank you for joining with me online. Today we're looking at various passages of Scripture related to the trial that Jesus underwent. And I'm going to read it for you if you'd like to get your Bibles and follow along. I'm reading in the NIV version, starting in the Gospel of John, chapter 18, verses 12 and 13, and then moving over to 19 to 24. Then the detachment of soldiers with its commander and the Jewish officials arrested Jesus. They bound him and brought him first to Annas, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest that year. Caiaphas was the one who had advised the Jews that it would be good if one man died for the people. The high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. "I have spoken openly to the world," Jesus replied. "I always taught in synagogues or at a temple, where all the Jews come together. I said nothing in secret. Why question me? Ask those who heard me. Surely they know what I said." When Jesus said this, one of the officials nearby struck him in the face. "Is this the way you answer the high priest?" he demanded. "If I said something wrong," Jesus replied, "testify as to what is wrong. But if I spoke the truth, why did you strike me?" Then Annas sent him, still bound, to Caiaphas, the high priest. Now let's look back to Mark 14, 53 to 65 to see what comes next. They took Jesus to the high priest, and all the chief priests, elders, and teachers of the law came together. Peter followed him at a distance, right into the courtyard of the high priest. There he sat with the guards and warmed himself at the fire. The chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for evidence against Jesus so that they could put him to death. But they did not find any. Many testified falsely against him, but their statements did not agree. Then some stood up and gave this false testimony against him. "We heard him say, 'I will destroy this man-made temple, and in 3 days will build another, not made by man.' Yet even then their testimony did not agree. Then the high priest stood up before them and asked Jesus, 'Are you not going to answer? What is this testimony that these men are bringing against you?' But Jesus remained silent and gave no answer. Again the high priest asked him, 'Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One?' 'I am,' said Jesus. 'And you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven.' The high priest tore his clothes. 'Why do we need any more witnesses?' he asked. 'You have heard the blasphemy. What do you think?' They all condemned him as worthy of death. Then some began to spit at him. They blindfolded him. They struck him with their fists, and they said, 'Prophesy.' And the guards took him and beat him." And then let's turn over to Luke chapter 23, starting at verse 1. Then the whole assembly rose and led him off to Pilate, and they began to accuse him, saying, "We have found this man subverting our nation. He opposes payment of taxes to Caesar and claims to be Christ the King." So Pilate asked Jesus, "Are you the King of the Jews?" So Pilate, "Yes, it is as you say," Jesus replied. Then Pilate announced to the chief priests and the crowd, "I find no basis for a charge against this man." But they insisted, "He stirs up the people all over Judea by his teachings. He started in Galilee, and he has come all the way here." On hearing this, Pilate asked if the man was a Galilean. When he learned that Jesus was under Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who was also in Jerusalem at that time. When Herod saw Jesus, he was greatly pleased, because for a long time he had been wanting to see him. From what he had heard about him, he hoped to see him perform some miracle. He plied him with many questions, but Jesus gave him no answer. The chief priests and teachers of the law were standing there, vehemently accusing him. Then Herod and his soldiers ridiculed and mocked him. Dressing him in an elegant robe, they sent him back to Pilate. That day, Herod and Pilate became friends. Before this, they had been enemies. Pilate called together the chief priests and rulers of the people and said to them, "You brought me this man as one who was inciting the people to rebellion. I have examined him in your presence, and I have found no basis for your charges against him. Neither has Herod, for he sent him back to us, as you can see. He has done nothing to deserve death. Therefore I will punish him and then release him." With one voice they cried out, "Away with this man! Release Barabbas to us!" Barabbas had been thrown into prison for an insurrection in the city and for murder. Wanting to release Jesus, Pilate appealed to them again. But they kept shouting, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" For the third time he spoke to them. "Why? What crime has this man committed? I have found in him no grounds for the death penalty. Therefore I will have him punished and then release him." But with loud shouts, they insistently demanded that he be crucified. And their shouts prevailed. So Pilate decided to grant their demand. He released the man who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder, the one they asked for, and surrendered Jesus to their will. May God bless for understanding the reading of his word. Well, today we are going to continue on our journey to the cross and the resurrection. So far, in our series, we've looked in on Judas, and we saw how he betrayed Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. We listened in to the heartbreaking account of him never really accepting Jesus as Lord in his life, being more concerned about money and position than loyalty and submission. We visited with the disciples and Jesus in the upper room when they shared the Last Supper, and where Jesus had his last meal with those he was closest to, and instituted a new covenant. We followed him from the upper room to the Garden of Gethsemane, where we saw him pray to the Father 3 times, "Not my will, but thine be done." We saw that he had complete obedience and submission to his Father's will. And while he was there in the garden, we read that Judas came with a band of soldiers and betrayed him with a kiss. And it's that action that brings us to today, the arrest and the trial. The most unjust trial that ever happened in the history of mankind, we've been told. As I was reading about the trial and the injustices that took place, I was overwhelmed to think of just how much Jesus went through for us, how unfair it was, and yet how willingly and peacefully Jesus gave himself. He wasn't a coward. He wasn't fearful or weak. He was in control. He was brave, and he was strong. When the religious authorities, when they came to the garden that night and they arrested Jesus, they had already decided his fate. He wasn't innocent until proven guilty, He was guilty with no hopes of proving innocence. The only thing is that they hadn't yet decided what he was guilty of. Can you imagine? You see, the Sanhedrin, which was the highest ruling council of the Jews, they hated Jesus, and they hated everything that he stood for. They felt that they had to get rid of him in order to protect themselves. He challenged their authority. Remember, he called them hypocrites. He broke their laws about the Sabbath observance. Jesus actually healed people on the Sabbath. But the Jewish leaders, they defined this as work, which was forbidden. He mixed with people the Jewish leaders regarded as unclean, sinners, prostitutes, tax collectors. He made claims about himself that the Jewish leaders could not accept, that he was God's son. He was the promised Messiah. Now, normally the Sanhedrin was a pretty safe group to appear before, but not for Jesus. They had many rules in place that they were supposed to follow in their proceedings, but those rules, they were thrown out the window when it came to Jesus' trial. The trial, it was a mockery of justice. Normally there were certain things that would happen. According to the Jewish law, criminal cases could not be tried during the Passover season, and definitely not at night. They were to take place in the daytime. According to Jewish law, only an acquittal could be issued on the day of a trial. Guilty verdicts had to wait one night, one day, to see if any other witnesses came forward, and to also allow for feelings of mercy to arise from the members. Members of the Sanhedrin, they were supposed to fast and pray to God, asking if they had made the right decision. According to the Jewish law, all evidence had to be guaranteed by 2 or more witnesses, and what those witnesses said had to match exactly. They were examined separately, and they couldn't have any contact with one another. If there was only one witness, then the accused would be let go. They wouldn't be held or punished. Now, according to Jewish law as well, false witnesses were punishable by death. None of this was done with Jesus' trial. According to the Jewish law, a trial always began by bringing forth evidence for the innocence of the accused before the evidence of guilt was offered. We didn't see that happen, did we? But then again, what was he guilty of anyway? These were the Sanhedrin's own rules, and it's abundantly clear that in their eagerness to get rid of Jesus, they broke all of them. With Jesus' trial, there's actually 6 stages. And first we see that they take him to Annas in John 18:12. It says, "Then the detachment of soldiers with its commander and the Jewish officials arrest Jesus, and they bound him." You see, they regarded Jesus as being so dangerous and such a threat that they sent a detachment of soldiers and its commanders. And I read somewhere that was a tenth of a Roman legion. Somewhere between 400 to 600 soldiers were on duty to arrest Jesus, plus the Jewish leaders. They went to the garden and they bound the hands of Jesus, who gave himself up peacefully. And we all know Jesus only remained bound because he surrendered to his Father's will. He could have easily broken those bonds, but he chose not to. And then they brought him at first to Annas, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest that year. Now, Annas was still very powerful, and he carried a lot of weight with the Jews. He worked with the Romans to make things happen. And it said that he is the one who actually controlled the priesthood. You see, he is the one who controlled the money changers in the temple and the exchange rates that made it very lucrative. And when Jesus went in and he overturned those tables, you can imagine how upset that made Aeneas. This is the man that Jesus was brought before. And you know what he wants for the outcome. Verse 19 says, "Meanwhile, the high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching." Aeneas is looking for something that he can use to charge Jesus with, as he already knew what they were planning to do, but they needed a reason. And Jesus responds in verse 20. He says, "I have spoken openly to the world. I always taught in synagogues or at the temple, where all the Jews come together. I said nothing in secret. Why question me? Ask those who heard me. Surely they know what I said." And because of this response, one of the officials nearby slaps him in the face. "Is that the way you answer the high priest?" he demanded. I guess Jesus didn't say what they wanted him to say. "If I said something wrong," Jesus replied, "testify as to what is wrong. But if I spoke the truth, why did you strike me?" And then Aeneas sends him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. Can you imagine the tension in that room? Jesus had said and done nothing wrong. He spoke the truth. And remember, all this happened at night, before he appeared before Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin. The religious leaders knew they had no grounds to charge Jesus. In Mark 14:54, it says, "The chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for evidence against Jesus so that they could put him to death. But they did not find any." So what do you do when you can't find evidence and you know the person is innocent, but you're determined to find them guilty? Well, you find some witnesses that will say what you want them to say. So they tried to build evidence against him by using these false witnesses, but even their testaments didn't agree. And then we see some standing up and saying, "We heard him say, I will destroy this man-made temple, and in 3 days will build another not made by man." But their testimony didn't agree. Then the high priest stood up before them and asked Jesus, "Are you not going to answer? What is this testimony that these men are bringing against you?" But Jesus remained silent, and he gave no answer. Jesus knew that what they had said was not in fact what he said, and that trying to explain it would not clarify it for them. And at that time, any threat against a place of worship was punishable by death. Tearing down a temple was a serious situation. Again, the high priest asks him in verse 61, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One?" And this time, he responds, "I am," said Jesus. But he didn't stop there. "And you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One, coming on the clouds of heaven." He basically was saying, "You're standing in judgment of me now, but I will be the ultimate judge." Well, verse 63, we see the priest's reaction. He tore his clothes to dramatically show how terrible what Jesus said was. "Why do we need any more witnesses?" he asked. "You've heard the blasphemy. What do you think?" And they all condemned him as worthy of death. And some began to spit at him. They blindfolded him. They struck him with their fists, and they said, "Prophesy." And the guards, they took him and they beat him. Jesus could have defended himself. He could have called witnesses to his defense, people who would share what his character was like, the people he taught, the people he healed. Even the demons testified of his deity. But Jesus opened not his mouth. He was led as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearer is silent, so he opened not his mouth. They wanted him dead because he claimed to be God. And Jesus was convicted because he is God. Now, the Romans had taken away the Jews' power to administer capital punishment, so it was necessary for them to send him to Pilate to be sentenced to death. And they knew that he would not get a death penalty for blasphemy, so they came up with some political reasons why he should be found guilty. Encouraging people not to pay their taxes to Rome, claiming he was a king, causing riots all over the countryside, tax evasion, treason, terrorism. That would get Pilate's attention. But when Jesus goes before Pilate, he's silent. And Pilate can find no reason to find him guilty. So, upon hearing that he was from Galilee, he sends him to Herod, who was also in Jerusalem at the time. And Herod, he'd always wanted to see Jesus perform miracle. But when Jesus appears before Herod, he didn't respond. He remained silent. And this made Herod angry. And he and his men, they ridiculed Jesus and they mocked him. And they actually dressed him in an elegant robe and they sent him back to Pilate. And Pilate, once again, he tells the people he can find no reason to find Jesus guilty. And we read this in Luke 23. It says, Pilate called together the chief priests, the rulers, and the people. And he said to them, you brought me this man as one who was inciting the people to rebellion. I have examined him in your presence, and I have found no basis for your charges against him. Neither has Herod, for he has sent him back to us, as you can see. He has done nothing to deserve death. Therefore I will punish him and release him. Well, the people wouldn't have it. And they cry, away with this man, release Barabbas to us. At every Passover festival, the Roman governor would set free a prisoner chosen by the crowd. And Pilate asked the crowd whether they wanted Barabbas or Jesus set free. And the chief priest persuaded the crowd to ask Pilate to set Barabbas free and have Jesus put to death. They showed it for Pilate to crucify him. Now, Barabbas had been in prison for insurrection in the city, for murder. He was a terrorist, and yet they wanted him released and not Jesus. What crime had Jesus committed? What grounds were there for the death penalty? None. Pilate goes on to say, I'm not responsible for the death of this man. The whole crowd answered, let the responsibility for his death fall on us and on our children. And Pilate set Barabbas free and handed Jesus over to be crucified. What crime had Jesus committed? What grounds were there for the death penalty? None. What do we learn from this trial? Is there anything that would apply to our lives today? Well, J.D. Greer identifies 3 groups of people involved in the trial. And I think we can all identify with one of the groups, if not a little with all of them. The first group is the proud, and those people are represented by the Sanhedrin. These Jewish leaders, they didn't like what Jesus was teaching. And they were threatened and they were offended by him and by it. They valued their place and their roles in society, and they felt they needed to get rid of Jesus because he was saying that everyone was a sinner and that they were no better than the others. Oh, we don't like to be told that, do we? They didn't like to hear that without God's grace, they had no hope. that there was nothing they could bring to the negotiating table. Goodness wasn't enough, that they had to surrender to God's grace. And if anyone threatened their way of life or how they determined things should be, then woe to them. Well, the next group of people are the distracted, and they're represented by Pilate, according to Greer. Pilate tried to let Jesus go, but he was more interested in pleasing the people and keeping the calm so that he wouldn't get in trouble and lose his job. He was under pressure from Caesar to not have any more riots in Jerusalem because there had already been several riots under his reign. So he gives in, and he symbolically washes his hands of the outcome. He doesn't take a side. We have to take a side in life. We have to decide, are we for Jesus or are we against him? The third group of people is represented by Barabbas, and it is the spared. Barabbas was guilty of murder. He was a known convicted criminal, and he was rightly sentenced for his crimes. And yet, he got to go free. Greer says he can't help but wonder what happened to Barabbas after he was freed. And maybe you've thought of that yourselves. Did he see Jesus being scourged and say, "Thank you"? Did he follow Jesus to the cross and say, "Thank you"? Did he stop and think, that should have been me? That should have been my blood? We'll never know because Barabbas is not mentioned again in Scripture. He vanishes. But we do know that his name translates as son of a father. And Barabbas represents all of us, sons and daughters of the Father. Jesus died in our place, as he did for Barabbas. An unjust trial, an unfair sentence, lie after lie after lie. And Greer reminds us that Jesus did not open his mouth to respond with a single word of complaint. He suggests that when we are accused of something and we don't open our mouths to defend ourselves, it usually is because we are guilty. But Jesus was innocent. No wrongdoing at all. Could it be that behind the Sanhedrin, those pointing their fingers at him in judgment, Jesus saw God, the Father, pointing his finger of judgment at him, accusing Jesus of our sin? That's why he was quiet. Jesus understood that he was not being condemned because of his sin, but our sin, and he willingly accepted it. Jesus stood there silently. He accepted our guilt. He died instead of us and for us. May we remember his great sacrifice as Easter approaches and be eternally grateful. I want to thank you for joining with me today, and I pray God's blessing upon your week and your family. See you all again soon. God bless.